the change and exploring change. And this week is letter G. And for G, we're talking about grace, which is a beautiful word. I sometimes think it's a little bit misunderstood. A lot of the conversations that we've had in preparation for this, not that we really prepare for this, but we tend to mix grace and mercy or grace and forgiveness. And I think a lot of that is, from our Christian perspective, we think about grace as God's forgiveness of our sins that is given through God's grace, which is something that is freely given, not earned, right? But grace is so much bigger than forgiveness or mercy or justice. I think of grace as sort of the foundation of those things. And so if I think about it in that context, it's more aligned with God's love as a foundational aspect of all of those things that we do. Thomas Aquinas wrote a lot about grace. He wrote 4 articles in his Summa Theologica about grace. And he talks about grace as being an aspect of the soul. It is something that God imbues into us. And it is, as I interpret that, it is when we are acting most out of our sense of God's love for us, out of our belovedness, is when we are fully acting, no, maybe not fully, and maybe it's just moments, but we are acting out of grace. And so it is required, I think, for mercy and for forgiveness, but it is not limited to that.
Yeah, we can endeavor to forgive or endeavor to be merciful, but grace is something that comes to us outside of our own deliberate work.
Yes, it is a part of our being that we can call on, and our goal, our journey as human beings is to pull on that grace more than the other parts of ourselves. Aristotle would say it's not a virtue. It is a state of being. It is a part of who we are, and it is imbued in us, into our souls. Now, there's a whole lot of debate around whether or not it's in our soul and what that even means. But I like that concept, that it is innately a part of who we are through our belovedness. So as we think about that, and we think about what it means to truly endeavor to call on that part of ourselves, our better angels, as it were. I also think, though, that we give grace and we receive grace. And I've just been thinking a lot in these last little bit about what that has meant in my life. And I'm curious where you see the role of grace and how that has played out in your life. And is it something that you're consciously delving into and working to bring forward in your life, or is it just something that is present? And when is it present, and when is it harder to find that? Those are big questions, but...
All great questions. In thinking about grace, I sort of was asking myself, what would it mean to lead a graceful life? Because, sure, grace is a loaded theological term, right? There are many different ways of interpreting grace in theological terms. I guess I've been thinking about it more in maybe sort of practical, lived experience terms, and I know that when I feel most graceful is when I am the least self-conscious, not the most self-conscious. I think of back to the wild beasts. What's more graceful, really, than any wild animal? And you watch the elk milling around on the feed grounds right now, getting ready to head back into the high country, and I just see this natural flowing movement that sure looks like grace to me. And then I think about the people that we tend to think of being most graceful tend to be dancers or perhaps musicians. And so it's almost as if grace, unlike the wild animals, it's almost as if we people, human beings, need to sort of cultivate grace in our lives in a way. It almost takes practice, even though it's innate. We're born into it. It's bred into us through the grace of God, I believe. I don't know if that clarifies anything or muddies the waters even more.
It's interesting because Aquinas talks about this as well, that it is our most connectedness to our natural being.
Yeah.
And for animals, that's much easier because they don't have this free will that messes us up all the time, right? So we do have to make more of an effort to find that grace within ourselves.
To access
the grace.
Perhaps.
Or in the animal world, it is just innate, and they live within that, with that grace as a part of their beings.
I think for me, to that question of like, hey, how do you? The first beat for me is, can I accept it? Can I accept grace in my life? And can I accept how it extends to the light side and to the shadow side as well? Of course, the way that I talk about it all the time, which, we even joke about, I talk about it so much, is this belovedness, this idea of can I accept? Can I really... And I was joking with myself in my head when we were in staff meeting this morning, thinking like, when we were talking about grace this morning, like maybe sometime like one of our like giveaways to the church ought to be like marinade. Like this idea of like grace infuses every aspect of our being. It doesn't change my consistency, but it does add flavor to it. So if I can get comfortable with this idea that I am beloved in light of my giftedness in spite of my failures, which is a hard enough step for me, then I would say, slightly different from what you were saying, Brian, I would say, instead of can I cultivate that in my life, I would say, can I reckon with it? Like, because I think grace is something that we really struggle with. It's so detached from achievement. And almost everything we do from the time we come out of the womb, we get an APGAR score. Like a newborn baby has his or her first grade right at birth to like, are we meeting developmental mile markers? Are we, prepared to enter into kindergarten? And all that's about our ability to cultivate or develop ourselves or to achieve and the reckoning that we have in an achievement-oriented culture is just like, there's no achievement there. There's nothing. And we were joking earlier about the scandal of grace, and that's so scandalous. And I find as I share these ideas with groups of other human beings, like we really struggle to accept the fact that we or other human beings could, should, would be gifted with love or anything else that we didn't achieve,
that we
or
didn't
deserve
earn.
or earn.
Right.
Yeah.
And that is that gift, the gift freely given without any expectation. And we're not culturally set up that way. We're set up to achieve, but we also are set up to get something. Like, we do things for something. We try not to. Like, we preach not that's not the only way to be in the world, but we live in a culture where it is very, we use the word transactional a lot, but
Get all A's, get to go to college, graduate from college, get a good job that pays you well. And
all of those things. And grace isn't about that. Grace is something that we receive freely or we give freely without that expectation of a return on our investment,
Yeah.
right? And that's
No
very
ROI.
counterintuitive, countercultural for us. And I think the beauty of the natural world is they are not burdened with that in the same way.
Could
It's much
be.
more straightforward. I am a lion. I'm going to live in my lionness.
I'm going to go kill something and eat it.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's a return on that investment for the lion. But
Well,
it's
no,
not,
it's just being a lion,
Yeah.
right? Gosh, and something that occurred to me just now too is that this strange term we use about that story in Eden, that was our humanity's fall from grace, right? And gosh, in a way, wasn't it really our fall into grace? I mean, if grace is just this innate belovedness and promise that is actually delivered on by God when we're willing to receive it, that was not a fall from grace.
It's a really interesting take on the story of that. I'm sitting here noodling like, well, was that promise there? It was to some degree, and then it comes with Noah in a
Yeah.
more confirmed way, and Abraham in a
Yeah.
further defined way. But that banishment to the land of Nod somewhere east of Eden seems more grace-filled, perhaps, than at least the way that we look at it, than the garden would be.
although there became this self-awareness in the fall.
Right.
That suddenly we knew, oh, we're naked, oh, we're this, and that is that self-awareness that is the double-edged sword. I mean, thank goodness we have that. Thank goodness we have the ability to use our brains differently and think and make choices, but at the same time, it is what draws us out of that pure connection with God's love.
And that self-awareness or differentiation is what makes grace so scandalous too, in the sense of like, wait a minute, how can you give him or her that extra dose of love? Don't you see that there's a lack of equity here, and there was some transgression, there was some it totally upsets our sense of fairness and our sense of justice. It doesn't unbalance the scale, it tips the scale over and says the whole idea of weighing and measuring things doesn't matter.
Right.
Like, that's only important to you.
Right.
That's so hard. Like, wait a minute, but people need to be defended. Even I need to be defended.
Absolutely. Okay, now that's making my brain hurt a little bit.
Yeah.
That's tough stuff. And if you look at that in the context of mercy and justice justice meaning everyone gets their due for good or for bad. You wrong me, you need to be wronged. An eye for an eye and all of that. And that is so counter to this concept of grace.
So counter.
And yet it's still a part of our tradition and our culture.
And always will be.
And always will be. And has a place.
It's a Christian ethic.
Well,
It just doesn't quite speak to the kingdom.
Right.
In the same way that we understand and respect and even admire the principles of justice and its balancing virtue, mercy. But there is this reality of God's love permeates so far beyond that. And not just on the light side, but on the side that really challenges our strongly held opinions, our desires, our dreams, our sense of fairness, the way that we relate to each other in the world. Woo. It's pretty mind-boggling.
It is pretty much. Right. And I think about, we use forgiveness a lot as our context for grace because it incorporates all of this. And I think the idea of forgiving if we don't feel that the wrong has been righted is almost impossible. Like, that's what makes it hard, and that's the grace.
Yeah. Sitting here thinking, I'm like, what's your most grace-filled moment?
Goodness.
I'm trying to think of what mine would be.
That's a tough one.
I'm sort of going through the mental filing cabinet, and the first thing that pops into my mind is somebody handing jade to me in a hotel ballroom in China, and like the fact that experience was so literally foreign,
Yeah.
and then also metaphorically foreign, that there are aspects to the story that are not bright.
Right.
Jade, a child abandoned at birth, not a beautiful story.
Right.
But yet there are these restorative aspects of receiving her into our family. Like, that felt really, really grace-filled in the sense of, as I look backwards, I'm like, oh my God, I never would have ever imagined something that wild would happen to me as I was growing up. Just never would have ever, like, wait, what? We would get on we would leave Jazz with, my mom and Cindy's mom, and we'd get on an airplane, we'd fly away, and we'd have all this cash, and then there was like Asia, and then all of a sudden, and then, the fact that it wasn't just Cindy and me in the room, there were almost 20 other families who had a deep desire, to add to their experience, mostly there out of some tragedy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
One couple had lost their 3 children in an automobile accident. Others, rugged infertility stories. Woo. That was a grace-filled moment for Jimmy and Cindy Bartz.
Yeah. It's beautiful.
Woo. Never could have dreamed that up.
Yeah.
Right.
I think I came up with one.
Yeah.
It's hard. For me, like most daughters or most kids, I had a problematic relationship with my mother. She was a brilliant and wonderful person, and I learned a lot from her, but she was difficult and in many ways that I don't need to go into, but one of them was her inability to ever admit imperfection. And when we moved her here in the last months of her life, and she passed away at the Living Center, and my sisters and I were sitting around her bed, and there was something about her that was so peaceful. I mean, she was fighting death. She did not go willingly, but there was a peacefulness about her and this vulnerability. And there was something in that moment and it didn't like happen for a moment and then come back, but I felt like I just was able to let go of all of that, all those years of hurt and disappointment and all of that mess, and just love her.
Just like a purge.
It just was like, oh my God, I just love this woman.
Wow.
And that was great.
Thanks for sharing that.
That's a graceful moment.
Yeah, big tear up a little bit.
Good.
Yeah. Gosh, I've had so many moments of grace in my life. When grace was extended to me when I probably least deserved it. Well, I don't know. I think we all deserve grace all the time. But those were the moments when I felt like I least deserved some sort of forgiveness or Brian, this is going to be okay.
Yeah.
So I've had many of those moments in my life. The one that was not graceful, but these are not graceful. I'm sorry.
Yeah, they're a challenge.
The one that comes to mind was an experience I had this fall when I was down in Utah in the desert, and I had been struggling with some problems in my life, and I got to the point one day I was out in this area called the Water Pocket Fold, and I had walked up this little canyon, and I said a prayer, and I just said, I know that there must be a lesson that I'm supposed to, that I can learn from this experience that I'm going through now. And there was just this moment where I didn't know what the lesson was, but I knew that it didn't even matter anymore, that I had been asking the wrong question, perhaps, and it was just this sense of peace. And that's the most recent profound moment of grace that I can think of.
Your story is reminding me of this fantastic scene in the movie The Mission. Have you all seen The Mission?
Yeah.
Maybe a long time ago, if you remember
long time ago.
De Niro character is a former slave trader becoming Jesuit, and his penance for the sin of being a slave trader is that on this expedition, he drags tied to him armor, like the weapons of war in the slave trade.
Yeah.
He drags through the jungle, and he's climbing these cliffs, and it makes him fall, and he reclimbs, and it's not the moment where you think at some point Jeremy Irons, the priest, the head architect of this penitent experience, will release him from this, and he never does, and it goes on far too long, and it is in the encounter of another group of natives, the outsider, the non-achievement oriented Western-based, sees it as an absurdity, comes over with a knife and cuts the rope, and he's liberated in this moment, this tearful moment, and you're like, of course.
Yeah.
Of course it was the indigenous person. Sure. It could be no, but you couldn't have conceived it, as we were thinking, and everybody's like, well, yeah, he needs to do that.
And for some reason, De Niro couldn't do it himself.
Do it himself.
Right.
No way. Yeah, no way.
It's a great story.
Grace comes from that unexpected thing.
Yeah.
Kind of takes us by surprise.
Yeah.
Wow. Oof. A lot of stuff, a lot to think about. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else have anything else you want to add?
Well, so grace and change.
Yeah, good question.
Maybe a question that we're posing for folks to consider, because I don't have anything really, nothing is coming to mind right now for me, but
as we're talking about this and the idea of grace coming from these unexpected places, I think you do have to be open to it at some level, right?
Yeah.
And I think as change is hard and scary, and what we're trying to show is that it really isn't as hard as scary. It takes courage, it takes humility, but that grace can come to us in those moments of ebb and flow, and in unexpected ways, and so it makes change an opportunity, and if we open ourselves up to it in a way that's not as scary, I guess.
Yeah.
I think so. When we resist change, a lot of it is a resistance to the possibility of grace, infusing our experiences in an unimagined way.
Yeah.
It's really holding tightly to a certain plan or set of expectations that we've been driving toward, and so we resist when circumstance begins to change or adjust or threaten those plans.
Right.
And then, hopefully we have that release, that whether it's an experience from rock bottom or that liberation, that letting go, acceptance, however we want to describe it. And hopefully then grace comes to our recovery, but it's never what we
Never what
Never
we
looks
planned.
It's
quite
never like
what we were-
everything's going to be okay now.
Right. Oh, now I know the lesson. No, maybe
All
not.
clear.
Yeah. So maybe the change can produce a lot of anxiety. A lot of fear. Usually fear of what's to come, and so if we can kind of cool it a little bit and have a little bit of calm in the midst of, if we can't do that, then we might be holding grace out.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Keeping that grace from entering our lives.
Right. Both of us did this sort of like holding your body really
Yeah,
rigid. And when you do that, you're not allowing the movement of the Spirit and the movement of grace in your life. You're like, stay away. We're not.
And very, very human
Very
reaction. right?
self-protection. We get it.
Protect
but
me.
Sometimes you just have to let
Yeah.
it go.
Yeah, it's like, I don't want to fall apart here.
Right.
But maybe that's the move. Fall apart.
Fall apart.
What do we got next week?
Next week is our last week for this particular Lenten conversation. We are on E, and the word for E is embrace. And Brian, you'll be leading us in a conversation about embrace, which seems like a great word to end with.
Yeah, feels good.
I like it. So thank you for watching this morning. Have a wonderful week, and we will see you on Sunday. And we will see you next week to discuss embrace.